Okay, so we have our basic column detail with this nice shadow gap, taking our inspiration from our Midjourney studies. So now what I'm going to do in 3D to push this that bit further is make some variations on this and also start to understand why this detail is looking so nice and why we like this detail so much. So start to really take care and look at, these chamfered details on the wood. We start to have this rough chamfered or filleted edges on this concrete base. We need to understand the proportions of this shadow gap where we get this elevated wood column, and how we can do that is through 3D modeling and iterating in 3D. So we have this version quickly modeled and rendered, and we can just start to model a few different variations based on proportion and scale. That's what it's about. If we get proportions and scale right in whatever we're designing, we're pretty much there. This is such a simple detail, but is so elegant. So how can we really focus on those small, elegant details like these, subtle chamfered edges, this little elevation shadow gap that splits the concrete base from this lovely wood. And we can start to understand that through sketching and through our 3D models. And so with any design process, I like to use the 3D model as almost this sketching, keeping it very loose at the start, not worrying too much about the output, but just trying to generate and think about different options at the start, and then comparing them as we go. So I'm going to do one version where we have this really slender 100mm column. And again, it's all about scale and proportion. Both of these are nice options in their own right, but they are a completely different design language. This one on the right is really long and thin. This one is obviously a different proportion. And we can start to think about this detail in here. To me, that looks nice, how this wooden element is just kind of levitating, and you can't really see if you were, let's extrude these out as if they were real columns. If we were walking through a house or whatever it is, you would not see, let's put a person in there for scale. Why has everyone got their tops off? Let's get Brian in there. Brian stand with the cane. In you go, Brian. Oh, he's moving. So now we have our human Brian in there. We can start to understand how these columns would feel if we were, viewing them in real life. And what we want to do is get this nice elevated shadow gap so that this, beautiful wooden column is just floating above this concrete base. Really simple, elegant detail. And again, in our 3D, we can just iterate on these dimensions. So what do we have there? We've got 15mm. Tiny little shadow gap, but maybe we want, something like this where it's actually just this like pinstripe. And this is why Midjourney is so good, because we can start to look at these amazing, compelling images and really start to think about how these materials are coming together. They all have different expressions. So this one, we have the concrete, and the wood is almost, becoming part of that concrete as one continuous surface. There's almost no shadow gap. Whereas this one, we have this little pinstripe between this base and this interesting wooden detail here, and then this one again, just that slight elevation. And so we can start to think about all of these different options and study them in 3D. And so I've got 5 different variations now of this column detail, keeping base parameter the same. So this base we keep, but I've kept the same proportion throughout, or the same height, sorry. All inspired from this initial Midjourney study with this concrete base and then the wooden column elevated, but then we start to develop it a little bit and iterate. Now what happens when we change up the proportions of these columns? And what happens if we start to introduce this double split column, which I love? And then what happens when we start to, think about these shadow gaps in different thicknesses and different proportions? And this way of just, exploring, iterating side by side, we can really start to understand what we like, what we're drawn to, and then develop that further. We can start to really go into the details of all these chamfered edges and these more refined details as we go through this process. And then we can start to put these into our environments and see how they look in context. But great little exercise, I think.